Awesome. Alrighty, so welcome everybody. This is the Web Development Club's Blazor and .NET Web App Talk. Over the next 30 minutes, I'm going to give you a brief introduction to .NET Web Applications, including the newest form of that, which is Blazor. I'll go a little over the history, what .NET is, what Blazor is, and then I'll give a short demo at the very end, very surface level, just sort of to give you an idea of what it's all about. Ready, so let's get started. So before we talk about Blazor and .NET Web Apps, we have to talk about .NET. And .NET is, in short, Microsoft's developer suite. It has all of the different technologies that Microsoft provides us. And that can take the form of desktop applications. You can see that here. Mobile, gaming, Unity, as well as some of their tools. Visual Studio, of course, is the popular one. GitHub, NuGet, which is their package manager. But the one that we're going to focus on for today is, of course, the web applications, which you can see right here, ASP.NET, and then, of course, Blazor. So C# is what's primarily used in the .NET suite. It is a programming language developed by Microsoft, of course, and it's extremely similar to Java. And obviously, Java is what's used in the computer science intro courses here at UW-Madison. And I've done this personally. It's really easy to get into C# from a Java background. Just to name off sort of a few things, it's object-oriented, there's garbage collection. The syntax is very similar. It's strongly typed. It has single inheritance. It is essentially just Microsoft's version of Java with a different name. And it's very easy to learn, but it has a lot of features and complexities that can make it difficult to master and make it a very powerful language as well. So, sort of reiterating on that, originally C#'s main disadvantage was that it was primarily limited to like Windows applications, but now that's since been expanded to have options for both Linux and Mac in the form of .NET Core. It's also used for mobile development, Xamarin, and game development Unity. Those are two names that you saw, or you may have noticed on the first slide. And then, of course, web development is also possible with C#. So some more advanced C# features, just to give you a sort of brief overview of them. There's LINQ, which allows for some SQL-style syntax in C# code to go through lists and that sort of thing. There's async, which is a keyword that you can use in methods to create asynchronous methods. This is an example of this over here. You can essentially have methods sort of run on the side asynchronously while the rest of the method or the rest of the program operates. And then there's this await keyword that essentially means that you have to halt execution or just wait until whatever the task up here is finished. And then, of course, there's generics, which, again, if you're from Java, this will probably be familiar. Essentially, just have a generic type here, and you can create classes and functions that use generic types instead of more specific ones. And obviously, these can be limited by an interface or something. There's a lot of power here. It's a really great language, and it's set up very nicely. And then here is an additional LINQ example. You can sort of see here. There's a string, and then we have this sort of like SQL style syntax where it's essentially like a select statement, select from greet or from greetings, where greet length is greater than 3. So if you have knowledge of SQL, you can also employ that in your C# code. And just sort of on a broader note, if you take a look at this code, it looks very similar to Java code with how it's all set up. Alrighty, so now that we have C# out of the way, we can sort of take a look at the history of .NET web applications. I won't spend too much time on this, but I do think it is important to sort of understand where .NET web apps have come from so that we can understand the significance of Blazor. So first, 2002, ASP.NET is released. ASP.NET is for all intents and purposes, just the .NET or the web app side of Microsoft's .NET suite. From 2002 to 2008, it was the web forms era. Web forms was the first sort of quote-unquote version of ASP.NET. It relied heavily on the server. And at the time, this worked because clients were pretty weak. Obviously, iPhones weren't really a thing. My client would really just render HTML documents. A quote that I saw was that it was a stateful model over a stateless network. And as a result, it relied on JavaScript sort of to implement those client-side features. But obviously, once the iPhone was, or a lot of users were using iPhone, clients became more powerful in general. This wasn't going to work anymore. Then it moved on to ASP.MVC, which stands for Model View Controller. This was, or you'd use the Model View Controller paradigm. It had a number of improvements, such as the package manager, NuGet, as well as Razor components, which are a big part of Blazor, and I'll explain that soon. I guess the main downside of MVC was that it was limited to Windows platforms, and then, or it could only be hosted on Windows platforms, to be more specific. And then finally, 2014 to the present, we have ASP.NET Core. Core, again, it's cross-platform, and Blazor is a part of that. It was introduced in 2018 or 2019, I believe. And that was the original server-side and WebAssembly version, which, again, sorry, I'll explain more later, came out after that. So yeah, what is Blazor? It is a web framework developed by Microsoft in 2019, I guess. Combines C# and HTML, CSS. It replaces the need for JavaScript almost, because as I sort of talked about in this slide, these early forms of ASP.NET, they relied pretty heavily on JavaScript to do that client-side functionality, because they did most of the server-side back-end stuff, but you needed something. You couldn't have it constantly getting GET and POST requests to update every little thing on the web page. But Blazor does allow you to replace, or it almost replaces the need for JavaScript. You can still use it if you want. There are still ways to do that, but I personally haven't had to. Blazor is a single-page application, which means that it just hosts one sort of page and it updates it, which hurts search engine optimization, so it doesn't really. Blazor apps wouldn't show up as high on in search engines, but there are ways around that. I haven't had to worry about that personally, but there are workarounds to that. And then Blazor controls both the front end and the back end, which is exciting, and it's all C# and HTML, of course. So components are a big part of Blazor. Everything in Blazor is made up of Razor components. They are a combination of HTML and C#. So they have this sort of, the front end is HTML, and they have some small C# back-end code to implement their functionality. And then they can be reused throughout a web application. And a bunch of these components will make up a page. And this is a screenshot from the Blazor template application, which I'm going to walk through at the end of this presentation. One of the Razor components on that page is counter, which is essentially just this part outlined here. There's also index, like the home page, that's outlined here. But you could essentially put counter on any page if you just sort of put a counter tag, which is a really nifty feature. It allows you to reuse a lot of your code. You can sort of nest components inside of each other. It allows for a lot of flexibility. There are two main forms of Blazor, which I briefly sort of mentioned earlier. There's Blazor WebAssembly and Blazor Server. Blazor WebAssembly is the client-side version of Blazor. It has a large download to the web browser, but once it's downloaded, no server connection is needed unless explicitly specified. So it allows you to operate a lot in the client, which again, sort of, when I talked about the history of .NET web apps, that was one of their main weaknesses, is that they heavily relied on the server and having that server connection, and they couldn't really do much client-side functionality. That sort of changed in like later versions, but this sort of Blazor is the final step in that process. And then there's Blazor Server, which has a smaller download and it loads much faster, but you need that server running ASP.NET Core, and being that it is server-side, you can hide more of the authentication secrets. All right, so now we're going to jump into a live demonstration of the Blazor template application, and then I'll modify it a little bit to sort of give you an idea of how Blazor works. Right, so here I will be doing all of my work in Visual Studio. Visual Studio is a really great development tool. It allows for really easy line-by-line debugging. It's a great tool overall. So we're going to create a new project. As you can see here are if I opened up recent here, the two forms of Blazor, server and WebAssembly. I'm going to create server for now, but I will show a WebAssembly one in a second, or more advanced WebAssembly one. So I will create this. We're just going to use .NET 5. And then once this loads up, I will load up the presentation, or load up the, oh, it's not responding. That's new. Well, hopefully that works. I think I have a push to talk key, so it's probably reacting to that. All right, here we go. So now we're in the this new project that I created, this solution. We have a bunch of things that were automatically created. I'm just sort of going to walk through the folder setup. We have these program and startup C# files. These are primarily for if you wanted to enable certain, if you had a bunch of packages and you wanted to configure those, you would do that here. But then where things get interesting are these folders here. We have pages and shared. As you can see in here, there are these .razor files. And close this real quick. Before I get any further though, I will start up the application and I will give you an idea of what this web application looks like. You can see it's building down here. Pages is where all of the main pages are stored. So they have a URL that you can go to, and then these components are typically on a page. It doesn't really matter. That's just sort of for organization purposes. The actual structure of that folder doesn't matter. Yeah, once this loads, I will sort of give you a tour of the Blazor template application. Alrighty, so here we are. You can see the title up here, Web Dev. This is the home index page. Hello world. You have this little survey here. Has a link. Click that, opens up in a new tab. We're taken to survey. I'm not going to worry about that though. There's this navigation bar on the side here with 2 additional pages that we can go to. There's a counter page, which essentially just has this button that we can click. And as we click it, it increments here and is reflected on the page. There's also this fetch data page, which doesn't look like it does much, but it creates this table here and it has some temperature information for each date. As you can see, it fetches data from a service, which I'll go into in a second. But yeah, this is a pretty simple template application. It has a few pages, has some functionality, user interaction here. If I go back to the project now, we can see the pages here. We have counter, fetch data, and index. So those are the main 3 pages that we saw in the template application. I'll start at index. It's pretty simple. We just have at page at the top that sort of indicates the URL because it's essentially that default URL is just a slash. We have an h1 tag, hello world, welcome to your new app, and then we have this HTML tag here, which is called survey prompt, and then it passes in a parameter for title. Now this is a Razor component. If you look here in the shared folder, we have a survey prompt Razor component as well, and this corresponds to this Razor component. As you can see, it goes web dev shared survey prompt. Now if we go to survey prompt, open this up, there's some more code in here. We have the title here. Please take our brief survey with the link. Tell us what you think. This was essentially the code that we saw on that homepage. What's interesting though is we saw this attribute that was passed in, how is Blazor working for you? Now that code is defined here, the title, and then that title is used. So as you can see, as it states here, this demonstrates how a parent component can supply parameters to a child component. If we wanted to, say for example, include this on the counter page, we could just go to counter, essentially do the same thing. If we wanted to change title, please take our survey. You can probably imagine what will happen when we rebuild the solution and launch the web app. It's just going to render this same survey prompt on the counter page, but with a different title. Once this loads up, I can demonstrate that, but I'll go back to the project real quick. There's also, here I'll talk about the counter page. As you can see, it has a different URL at the top, /counter. Pretty much the basic layout of what we had here. I guess one thing I should mention is the @ symbol is what's used in Razor components to switch between HTML and C# code. That was probably something I should have mentioned earlier, but you can see it's used here because it's referencing the C# code down here. It defines the integer. It has this function, and then @currentCount indicates that it's referencing this C# integer. Same here, @onClick increment count shows that it's referencing this function. And then, as you can probably see, this is just how the counter page works. Is when you click this button, it runs increment count, which just increments the integer, and then that's reflected up here. So now that we're back in the application, we can see the survey prompt here. If we go here, it has an updated title essentially, but it's also on this page. So if you wanted to, this is really nifty because you can just essentially reuse all of these components across your pages. And if you have a really big web app, this allows you to just change or make changes to the components that are reflected across all pages. So if I had this survey prompt component on 100 pages, I wouldn't want to have this actual code pasted all the time. I could just go to the component itself, edit it, and then all those changes would be reflected. So I'll close that now. If, for example, I will get rid of this. I guess I'll go to the last page first before I do anything else, which is fetch data. This was essentially just the page with the table and all of the temperature information. Here we can sort of see a for each loop being used within HTML code. As you can see, there's the @ symbol, which indicates that we're switching over to C# code. So we have a for each statement. It's just iterating through this array of forecast information. And then it'll just create a row for each one, and it'll display some information. If we go to the data folder, this is where the weather forecast service is. This is sort of just a class containing all of the information. And then this is the service. You can actually see the async keyword being used here, where it will return everything. But yeah, this just essentially just returns all of the information. And then onInitialize async is ran when the page first loads, and then it just sets forecast, and then that is what creates the table here. So one thing that we can do is say we wanted to actually edit that information. One easy way that we could do that is, say, have a button that when clicked it would just clear all the data, if, say, we wanted that functionality, or set everything to 0. So what we could do is, it would probably be pretty easy to just implement that here, but if, for the sake of the example, we wanted to create a component that could be reused across our web app, we could go into our shared folder and we could create a new Razor component. As you can see, it's recommended here. So we'll click Add Razor Component. I'll call this Clear Button. Then I'll add that in. And what I want to do here is say I want to make this component reusable, so I want to have some parameters that can sort of be set by the parent component. Say I want a description that would sort of like be on the button. I can do that real quick. Have a parameter tag. Then we have this public string description here. And I guess for the sake of argument, I should also make the button itself. Then I use @description to indicate that we are taking this code here. So if we click here, yeah, you can see clear button.description. And then if we wanted to reference this component on fetch data, we would just go into fetch data, and then we would we've essentially made a new HTML tag in essence. Because we can just create an HTML tag for clear button, and then we're done. But we want to still specify this description parameter. As you can see, it comes up here, and we'll just call this clear data, or reset data. So now if we load up our project, as you can probably expect, this button will now be visible on the fetch data page. And I would then obviously be able to use this on any other page. So we have this reset data button. The only problem is it also comes with this title here, but it doesn't actually affect the data. And now we run into a little bit of a problem because we want to somehow have this child component edit the data in the parent component. So one thing that we can potentially do from this is pass in a function. So what I'm going to do here is create a function that would essentially just reset all of the temperatures to 0. So I will copy paste that from a different project. Just set to 0, goes through the forecast, and it just sets them all to 0. I could also just clear the array, anything like that. It doesn't really matter. And now I'll go back to my clear button component, and I'll create a new parameter called onClickClear. It's going to be an event callback for a mouse event, so essentially just being clicked. And when I go into my button, I can specify a parameter at onClick, which you'll probably recognize from the counter page. They use this here as well to increment it. And then I'll specify onClickClear. So when the button is clicked here, it will call this event callback. And because this is a parameter, we can go into our clear button and specify that here as well. We'll specify that as set to 0. So now if I save all of this and rebuild our project for the final time, we'll be able to see that functionality actually implemented. And I mean, you're probably thinking that you could just implement the button here, and for this specific case, that would just be easier. But obviously, there are many more cases where that wouldn't be as simple. So yeah, it sets all of the. I only specified the Celsius temperature, so it sets all of them to 0, and the Fahrenheit is updated accordingly because the temperature is 0. You could also just clear all of these, anything like that. Because it's all pulled from the same data. On refresh, it just resets, so you just do that again. So that is the basic demo for this one. I'm also just going to load up a project that I found in a Blazor tutorial that I think is very helpful. It sort of gives you an idea of what's possible with Blazor. Actually, I'll pull up the next slide. It's at this GitHub link. It's called Finance Mentor. I originally saw it in this YouTube tutorial here, sort of just reviewing for this talk. I think it's a really good example of what like I said, Blazor is possible. So if you go into here, immediately you can notice that there are several different projects in this solution. In our original one that I just did, it only had the one Blazor server. Whereas this one, this is a WebAssembly or Blazor WebAssembly with a ASP.NET Core sort of API backend. There's this shared project, which both of these projects have access to. It just defines some basic classes and enumerables. And then there's this test method, or this test project, which I won't get into. But if we actually explore into here, it'll probably help if I launch the project. Essentially what's going on here is we have the WebAssembly, the Blazor WebAssembly project, which is loaded up, and then it will communicate with the .NET or ASP.NET backend to do all of or on the server side. So once this loads up, I can sort of just show you around in there. Oh, it loaded up on my, here we go. As you can see, this is much snazzier and better looking than the template Blazor app, but it has essentially the same thing where it has this navigation bar, some different tables or some different pages that you can navigate to. Here we have some graphs which reflect data that is stored on the server. We can go to earnings, which actually shows the data itself. There's a way here to delete. This is essentially just the fetch data table, but there's a delete button here, so you can delete individual tables or individual rows, entries. I'll just go ahead and do that. Makes a little pop-up here, delete. I can input a new one for $100. Submit that. It's created here. And there's a similar expense page. Then that would reflect in the charts here. So I'll go out of here and I'll just sort of like give a brief overview of how this actually works. So the WebAssembly page we have some components here. We have some services, then we have some shared, we sort of have the navigation bar and all that. And then on the back end we have the sort of the ASP.NET API. So you have some controllers. If we go into here, we can see the earnings controller. And this essentially just has, you can see the API route. There's some tags here, essentially just indicating that this is like the get method, this is the post, this is the delete request. And then these would be called on the actual page itself. If I go here, expense form. Yeah, so you can see it's posting to the expenses API call. I recommend looking at the video because this goes a lot more in depth on this project, but this sort of hopefully will give you an idea of how you can have the client side Blazor WebAssembly project here with the back end ASP.NET application. And as you'll notice, this is all done C# and HTML, so it uses the same language throughout the entire project, which is very nice. You don't have to worry about different languages for front end versus back end. It's all just C# and HTML. So I'll go ahead and close this and sort of walk through the final slides of my presentation. Like I mentioned, I'll post these slides afterwards so that you can click on all the links as well. For Blazor installation, you have to install .NET Core, most recent version. I think it's actually .NET 5 now. I think that was released recently. You can use either Visual Studio Code, or command line to play around in Blazor. Of course, I would recommend Visual Studio, or at least Visual Studio Code. And then here, obviously, it's the ASP.NET and web development option that you would click when you're using the installer. And then some of my final thoughts. Blazor is a very new technology, but there is a lot of hype around it. You don't really see it being used in on a big, wide scale at this point, just because it's so new. But it will likely be Microsoft's next big thing. And because many companies operate within the Microsoft .NET suite, Blazor will play a big role going into the future. Right now, it's primarily going to be used for sort of intranet applications, so any apps that are sort of used by like a company's employees. But I could see that expanding in the future as Blazor becomes more and more advanced, and it advances forward. Then I've sort of attached some more links that I found helpful in researching for this presentation. And that will about wrap up my my talk on .NET Web Apps and Blazor. If there are any questions, feel free to speak now.